Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
The Family of the Vourdalak by Aleksei Konstantinovich Tolstoy. 1815, Vienna. While the Congress had been in session, the city had attracted all the most distinguished European intellectuals, the fashion leaders of the day, and, of course, members of the highest diplomatic elite. But the Congress of Vienna was no longer in session. Royalist émigrés were preparing to return to their country chateau, hoping to stay there this time. Russian soldiers were anxiously awaiting the time when they could return to their abandoned homes, and discontented Poles, still dreaming of liberty, were wondering whether their dreams would come true back in Krakow under the protection of the precarious independence that had been arranged for them by the trio of Prince Metternich, Prince Hardenberg, and Count Nesselrode. It was as if a masked ball was coming to an end. Of the assembled guests, only a select few had stayed behind and delayed packing their bags, in the hope of still finding some amusement, preferably in the company of the charming and glamorous Austrian ladies. This delightful group of people, of which I was a member, met twice a week in a chateau belonging to Madame the Dowager Princess of Schwarzenberg. It was just a few miles from the city centre, just beyond a little hamlet called Hitzing. The splendid hospitality of our hostess, as well as her amiability and intellectual brilliance, made any stay at her chateau extremely agreeable. Our mornings were spent à la promenade. We lunched all together, either at the chateau or somewhere in the grounds, and in the evenings, seated around a welcoming fireside, we amused ourselves by gossiping and telling each other stories. A rule of the house was that we should not talk about anything to do with politics. Everyone had had enough of that subject. So our tales were based either on legends from our own countries or else on our own experiences. One evening, when each of us had told a tale, and when our spirits were in that tense state which darkness and silence usually create, the Marquis d'Urfé, an elderly émigré we all loved dearly for his childish gaiety and for the piquant way in which he reminisced about his past life and good fortunes, broke the ominous silence by saying, "Your stories, gentlemen, are all out of the ordinary, of course. But it seems to me that each one lacks an essential ingredient. I mean, authenticity. For I am pretty sure that none of you has seen with his own eyes the fantastic incidents that he has just narrated, nor can he vouch for the truth of his story on his word of honor as a gentleman." We all had to agree with this, so the elderly gentleman continued after smoothing down his jabot. "As for me, gentlemen, I know only one story of this kind, but it is at once so strange, so horrible, and so authentic, that it will suffice to strike even the most jaded imaginations with terror. Having unhappily been both a witness to these strange events and a participant in them, I do not, as a rule, like to remind myself of them, but just this once I will tell the tale, provided, of course, the ladies present will permit me." Everyone agreed instantly. I must admit that a few of us glanced furtively at the long shadows which the moonlight was beginning to sketch out on the parquet floor. But soon our little circle huddled closer together, and each of us kept silent to hear the Marquis's story. Monsieur d'Urfé took a pinch of snuff, slowly inhaled it, and began as follows. "Before I start, mesdames," said d'Urfé, "I ask you to forgive me if, in the course of my story, I should find occasion to talk of my affaires du cœur more often than might be deemed appropriate for a man of my advanced years. But I assure you that they must be mentioned if you are to make full sense of my story. In any case, one can forgive an elderly man for certain lapses of this kind, surrounded as I am by such attractive young ladies. It is no fault of mine that I am tempted to imagine myself a young man again. So, without further apology, I will commence by telling you that in the year 1759 I was madly in love with the beautiful Duchesse de Gramont. This passion, which I then believed was deep and lasting, gave me no respite either by day or by night, and the Duchesse, as young girls often do, enjoyed adding to my torment by her coquetry. So much so that, in a moment of spite, I determined to solicit and be granted a diplomatic mission to the Hospodar of Moldavia, who was then involved in negotiations with Versailles over matters that it would be as tedious as it would be pointless to tell you about. The day before my departure, I called on the Duchesse. She received me with less mockery than usual, and could not hide her emotions as she said, "D'Urfey, you are behaving like a madman, but I know you well enough to be sure that you will never go back on the decision once taken. So I will only ask one thing of you. Accept this little cross as a token of my affection, and wear it until you return. It is a family relic which we treasure a great deal. With galanterie that was perhaps misplaced at such a moment, I kissed not the relic, but the delightful young hand which proffered it to me, and I fastened the cross around my neck. You can see it now. Since then, I have never been parted from it. I will not bore you, mesdames, with the details of my journey, nor with the observations that I made on the Hungarians and the Serbians, those poor and ignorant people, who, enslaved as they were by the Turks, were brave and honest enough not to have forgotten either their dignity or their time-honored independence. It's enough for me to tell you that, having learned to speak a little Polish during my stay in Warsaw, I soon had a working knowledge of Serbian as well, for these two languages, like Russian and Bohemian, as you no doubt know very well, are only branches of one and the same root, which is known as Slavonian. Anyway, I knew enough to make myself understood. One day I arrived in a small village. The name would not interest you very much. I found those who lived in the house where I intended to stay in a state of confusion, which seemed to me all the more strange because it was a Sunday, a day when the Serbian people customarily devote themselves to different pleasures, such as dancing, arquebus shooting, wrestling, and so on. I attributed the confusion of my hosts to some very recent misfortune, and was about to withdraw when a man of about 30, tall and impressive to look at, came up to me and shook me by the hand. Come in, stranger," he said. "Don't let yourself be put off by our sadness. You'll understand it well enough when you know the cause." He then told me about how his old father, whose name was Gorcha, a man of wild and unmanageable temperament, had got up one morning and had taken down his long Turkish arquebus from a rack on the wall. "My children," he had said to his two sons, Georges and Pierre, "I am going to the mountains to join a band of brave fellows who are hunting that dog Ali Bek." That was the name of a Turkish brigand who had been ravaging the countryside for some time. "Wait for me patiently for 10 days, and if I do not return on the 10th, arrange for a funeral mass to be said, for by then I will have been killed. But," old Gorcha had added, looking very serious indeed, "if, may God protect you, I should return after the 10 days have passed, do not, under any circumstances, let me come in. I command you, if this should happen, to forget that I was once your father, and to pierce me through the heart with an aspen stake, whatever I might say or do, for then I would no longer be human. I would be a cursed Vourdalak, come to suck your blood. It is important at this stage to tell you, mesdames, that the Vourdalaks, the name given to vampires by Slavic peoples, are, according to local folklore, dead bodies who rise from their graves to suck the blood of the living. In this respect, they behave like all types of vampire, but they have one other characteristic which makes them even more terrifying. The Vourdalaks, mesdames, prefer to suck the blood of their closest relatives and their most intimate friends. Once dead, the victims become vampires themselves. People have claimed that entire villages in Bosnia and Hungary have been transformed into Vourdalaks in this way. The Abbé Augustin Calmet, in his strange book on apparitions, cites many horrible examples. Apparently, commissions have been appointed many times by German emperors to study alleged epidemics of vampirism. These commissions collected many eyewitness accounts. They exhumed bodies which they found to be sated with blood and ordered them to be burned in the public square after staking them through the heart. Magistrates who witnessed these executions have stated on oath that they heard blood-curdling shrieks coming from these corpses at the moment the executioner hammered his sharpened stake into their hearts. They have formal depositions to this effect, and have corroborated them with signatures and with oaths on the Holy Book. With this information as background, it should be easier for you to understand, mesdames, the effect that old Gorcha's words had on his sons. Both of them went down on their bended knees and begged him to let them go in his place. But instead of replying, he had turned his back on them and had set out for the mountains, singing the refrain of an old ballad. The day I arrived in the village was the very day that Gorcha had fixed for his return, so I had no difficulty understanding why his children were so anxious. This was a good and honest family. Georges, the older of the two sons, was rugged and weather-beaten. He seemed to me a serious and decisive man. He was married, with two children. His brother, Pierre, a handsome youth of about 18, looked rather less tough and appeared to be the favourite of a younger sister called Stenka, who was a genuine Slavic beauty. In addition to the striking beauty of her features, a distant resemblance to the Duchesse de Gramont struck me especially. She had a distinctive line on her forehead, which, in all my experience, I have found only on these two people. This line did not seem particularly attractive at first glance, but became irresistible when you have seen it a few times. Perhaps I was still very naive. Perhaps this resemblance, combined with a lively and charmingly simple disposition, was really irresistible. I do not know. But I had not been talking with Stenka for more than 2 minutes when I already felt for her an affection so tender that it threatened to become something deeper still if I stayed in the village much longer. We were all sitting together in front of the house around a table laden with cheeses and dishes of milk. Zdenka was sewing. Her sister-in-law was preparing supper for her children, who were playing in the sand. Pierre, who was doing his best to appear at ease, was whistling as he cleaned a yagatan, or long Turkish knife. Georges was leaning on the table, with his head in his hands and looking for signs of movement on the great highway. He was silent. For my part, I was profoundly affected by the general atmosphere of sadness, and, in a fit of melancholy, looked up at the evening clouds which shrouded the dying sun, and at the silhouette of a monastery which was half hidden from my view by a black pine forest. This monastery, as I subsequently discovered, had been very famous in former times, on account of a miraculous icon of the Virgin Mary, which, according to legend, had been carried away by the angels and set down on an old oak tree. But at the beginning of the previous century, the Turks had invaded this part of the country. They had butchered the monks and pillaged the monastery. Only the walls and a small chapel had survived. An old hermit continued to say mass there. This hermit showed travellers around the ruins and gave hospitality to pilgrims who, as they walked from one place of devotion to another, liked to rest a while at the monastery of Our Lady of the Oak. As I have said, I didn't learn all this until much later, for on this particular evening my thoughts were very far away from the archaeology of Serbia. As often happens when one allows one's imagination free rein, I was musing on past times. on the good old days of my childhood, on the beauties of France that I had left for a wild and faraway country. I was thinking about the Duchesse de Gramont, and, why not admit it, I was also thinking about several other ladies who lived at the same time as your grandmothers, the memory of whose beauty had quietly entered my thoughts in the train of the beautiful Duchesse. I had soon forgotten all about my hosts and their terrible anxiety. Suddenly Georges broke the silence. "Wife," he said, "at exactly what time did the old man set out?" "At 8 o'clock. I can clearly remember hearing the monastery bell." "Well, that's all right then," said Georges. "It cannot be more than 7:30. And he again looked for signs of movement on the great highway which led to the dark forest. "I have forgotten to tell you, madame, that when the Serbians suspect that someone has become a vampire, they avoid mentioning him by name or speaking of him directly, for they think that this would be an invitation for him to leave his tomb. So Georges, when he spoke of his father, now referred to him simply as the old man." There was a brief silence. Suddenly, one of the children started tugging on Shdenka's apron and crying, "Auntie, when will Grandpa be coming back?" The only reply he got to this untimely question was a hard slap from Georges. The child began to cry, but his little brother, who by now was surprised and frightened, wanted to know more. "Father, why are we not allowed to talk about Grandpa?" Another slap shut him up firmly. Both children now began to howl, and the whole family made a sign of the cross. Just at that moment, I heard the sound of the monastery bell. As the first chime of the 8 was ringing in our ears, we saw a human figure coming out of the darkness of the forest and approaching us. "It is he! God be praised!" cried Shdenka, her sister-in-law, and Pierre all at once. "May the good God protect us," said Georges solemnly. "How are we to know if the 10 days have passed or not?" Everyone looked at him, terror-struck. But the human form came closer and closer. It was the tall old man with a silver moustache and a pale, stern face. He was dragging himself along with the aid of a stick. The closer he got, the more shocked Georges looked. When the new arrival was a short distance from us, he stopped and stared at his family with eyes that seemed not to see. They were dull, glazed, deep sunk in their sockets. "Well, well," he said, in a dead voice, "will no one get up to welcome me? What is the meaning of this silence? Can't you see I am wounded?" I saw that the old man's left side was dripping with blood. "Go and help your father," I said to Georges, "and you, Shdenka, offer him some refreshment. Look at him. He's almost collapsing from exhaustion." "Father," said Georges, going up to Gorcha, "show me your wound. I know all about such things, and I can take care of it." He was just about to take off the old man's coat when Gorcha pushed his son aside roughly and clutched at his body with both hands. "You are too clumsy," he said. "Leave me alone. Now you have hurt me." "You must be wounded in the heart," cried Georges, turning pale. "Take off your coat. Take it off. You must. I insist." The old man pulled himself up to his full height. "Take care," he said in a sepulchral voice. "If you so much as touch me, I shall curse you." Pierre rushed between Georges and his father. "Leave him alone," he said. "Can't you see he's suffering?" "Do not cross him," Georges' wife added. "You know he's never tolerated that." At that precise moment, we saw a flock of sheep returning from pasture, raising a cloud of dust as it made its way towards the house. Whether the dog which was escorting the flock did not recognize its own master, or whether it had some other reason for acting as it did, as soon as it caught sight of Gorcha, it stopped dead, hackles raised, and began to howl as if it had seen a ghost. "What is wrong with that dog?" said the old man, looking more and more furious. "What's going on here? Have I become a stranger in my own house? Have 10 days spent in the mountains changed me so much that even my own dogs do not recognize me? Did you hear that? Said Georges to his wife. What of it? He admits that 10 days have been spent. Surely not, for he's come back to us within the appointed time. I know what has to be done. The dog continued to howl. I want that dog destroyed, cried Gorcha. Well, did you hear me? Georges made no move, but Pierre got up with tears in his eyes and grabbed his father's arquebus. He aimed at the dog, fired, and the creature rolled over in the dust. That was my favourite dog, he said sulkily. I don't know why father wanted it to be destroyed. Because it deserved to be, bellowed Gorcha. Come on now, it's cold, and I want to go inside. While all this was going on outside, Zhidenka had been preparing a cordial for the old man, consisting of pears, honey, raisins laced with eau de vie, but her father pushed it aside with disgust. He seemed equally disgusted by the plate of mutton with rice that Georges offered him. Gorcha shuffled over to the fireplace, muttering gibberish from behind clenched teeth. A pine log fire crackled in the grate, and its flickering light seemed to give life to the pale, emaciated features of the old man. Without the fire's glow, his features could have been taken for those of a corpse. Zhidenka sat down beside him. Father, she said, you do not wish to eat anything. You do not wish to rest. Perhaps you feel up to telling us about your adventures in the mountains. By suggesting that, the girl knew that she was touching her father's most sensitive spot, for the old man loved to talk of wars and adventures. A trace of a smile creased his colourless lips, although his eyes showed no animation, and as he began to stroke his daughter's beautiful blonde hair, he said, Yes, my daughter, yes, Zhidenka. I would like to tell you all about my adventures in the mountains, but that must wait for another time, for I am too tired today. I can tell you, though, that Ali Bek is dead, and that he perished by my hand. If anyone doubts my word, continued the old man, looking hard at his two sons, here is the proof. He undid a kind of sack which was slung behind his back, and pulled out a foul, bloody head, which looked about as pale as his own. We all recoiled in horror, but Gorcha gave it to Pierre. Take it, he said, and nail it above the door, to show all who pass by that Ali Bek is dead, and the roads are free of brigands, except, of course, for the Sultan's janissaries. Pierre was disgusted, but he obeyed. Now I understand why that poor dog was howling, he said. He could smell dead flesh. Yes, he could smell dead flesh, murmured Georges. He had gone out of the room without anyone noticing him, and had returned at that moment with something in his hand, which he placed carefully against a wall. It looked to me like a sharpened stake. Georges, said his wife, almost in a whisper, I hope you do not intend to— My brother, Zhidenka added anxiously, what do you mean to do? No, surely you're not going to— Leave me alone, replied Georges. I know what I have to do, and I will only do what is absolutely necessary. While all this had been going on, night had fallen, and the family went to bed in the part of the house which was separated from my room only by a narrow partition. I must admit that what I had seen that evening had made an impression on my imagination. My candle was out. The moonlight shone through a little window near my bed, and cast blurred shadows on the floor and walls, rather like those we see now, mesdames, in this room. I wanted to go to sleep, but I could not. I thought this was because the moonlight was so clear, but when I looked for something to curtain the window, I could find nothing suitable. Then I overheard confused voices from the other side of the partition. I tried to make out what was being said. Go to sleep, wife, said Georges. And you, Pierre, and you, Zhidenka. Do not worry. I'll watch over you. But Georges, replied his wife, it is I who should keep watch over you. You worked all last night, and you must be tired. In any case, I ought to be staying awake to watch over our eldest boy. You know he hasn't been well since yesterday. Be quiet and go to sleep, said Georges. "I will keep watch for both of us." "Brother," put in Shchedenka in her sweetest voice, "there's no need to keep watch at all. Father's already asleep. He seems calm and peaceful enough." "Neither of you understands what is going on," said Georges in a voice which allowed for no argument. "Go to sleep, I tell you, and let me keep watch." There followed a long silence. Soon my eyelids grew heavy, and sleep began to take possession of my senses. I thought I saw the door of my room opening slowly, and old Gorcha standing in the doorway. Actually, I did not so much see as feel his presence, as there was only darkness behind him. I felt his dead eyes trying to penetrate my deepest thoughts as they watched the movement of my breathing. One step forward, then another. Then, with extreme care, he began to walk towards me with a wolf-like motion. Finally, he leaped forward. Now he was right beside my bed. I was absolutely terrified, but somehow managed not to move. The old man leaned over me, and his waxen face was so close to mine that I could feel his corpse-like breath. Then, with a superhuman effort, I managed to wake up, soaked in perspiration. There was nobody in my room. But, as I looked towards the window, I could distinctly see old Gorcha's face pressed against the glass from outside, staring at me with his sunken eyes. By sheer willpower, I stopped myself from crying out, and I had the presence of mind to stay lying down, just as if I'd seen nothing out of the ordinary. Luckily, the old man was only making sure that I was asleep, for he made no attempt to come in, and after staring at me long enough to satisfy himself, he moved away from the window, and I could hear his footsteps in the neighboring room. Georges was sound asleep and snoring loudly enough to wake the dead. At that moment the child coughed, and I could make out Gorcha's voice. "You are not asleep, little one?" "No, Grandpa," replied the child, "and I would so like to talk with you." "So, you would like to talk with me, would you? And what would we talk about?" "We would talk about how you fought the Turks. I would love to fight the Turks." "I thought you might, child, and I brought back a little yagatan for you. I'll give it to you tomorrow." "Grandpa, give it to me now." "But, little one, why didn't you talk to me about this when it was daytime?" "Because Papa wouldn't let me." "He is careful, your papa. So, you really would like to have your little yagatan?" "Oh, yes, I'd love that, but not here, for Papa might wake up." "Where then?" "If we go outside, I promise to be good and not to make any noise at all." I thought I could hear Gorcha chuckle as the child got out of bed. I didn't believe in vampires, but the nightmare had preyed on my nerves, and just in case I should have to reproach myself in the morning, I got up and banged my fist against the partition. It was enough to wake up the 7 sleepers, but there was no sign of life from the family. I threw myself against the door, determined to save the child, but it was locked from the outside, and I couldn't shift the bolts. While I was trying to force it open, I saw the old man pass by my window with the little child in his arms. "Wake up! Wake up!" I cried at the top of my voice as I shook the partition. Even then, only Georges showed any sign of movement. "Where's the old man?" he murmured blearily. "Quick!" I yelled. "He's just taken away your child." With one kick, Georges broke down the door of his room, which, like mine, had been locked from the outside, and he sprinted in the direction of the dark forest. At last I succeeded in waking Pierre, his sister-in-law, and Shchedenka. We all assembled in front of the house, and after a few minutes' anxious waiting, we saw Georges return from the dark forest with his son. The child had apparently passed out on the highway, but he was soon revived, and didn't seem to be any more ill than before. After questioning him, we discovered that his grandpa had not, in fact, done him any harm. They had apparently gone out to talk together on the highway, undisturbed. But once outside, the child had lost consciousness without remembering why. Gorcha himself had disappeared. As you can imagine, no one could sleep for the rest of that night. The next day, I learned that the river Danube, which cut across the highway about a quarter of a league from the village, had begun to freeze over. Drift ice now blocked my route. This often happens in these parts sometime between the end of autumn and the beginning of spring. Since the highway was expected to be blocked for some days, I could not think of leaving. In any case, even if I could have left, curiosity, as well as a more powerful emotion, would have held me back. The more I saw Zdenka, the more I felt I was falling in love with her. I am not among those, mesdames, who believe in love at first sight of the kind which novelists so often write about, but I do believe that there are occasions when love develops more quickly than is usual. Zdenka's strange beauty, her singular resemblance to the Duchesse de Gramont, the lady from whom I had fled in Paris, and who I saw again in this remote setting, dressed in a rustic costume and speaking in a musical foreign tongue, the fascinating line on her forehead, like that for which I had been prepared to kill myself at least 20 times in France. All this, combined with the incredible, mysterious situation in which I found myself, everything helped to nurture in me a passion which, in other circumstances, would perhaps have proved itself to be more vague and passing. During the course of the day, I overheard Zdenka talking to her younger brother. "What do you think of all this?" she asked. "Do you also suspect our father?" "I dare not suspect him," replied Pierre, "especially since the child insists that he came to no harm. And as for father's disappearance, you know that he never used to explain his comings and goings." "I know," said Zdenka. "All the more reason why we must think about saving him. For you know that Georges—" Yes, I know. It would be useless to talk him out of it. We can at least hide the stake. He certainly won't go out looking for another one, since there is not a single aspen tree on this side of the mountains. Yes, let's hide the stake, but don't mention it to the children, for they might chatter about it with Georges listening." "We must take care not to let that happen," said Pierre, and they went their separate ways. At nightfall, we had still discovered nothing about old Gorcha. As on the previous night, I was lying on my bed, and the moonlight again stopped me from going to sleep. When at last sleep began to confuse my thoughts, I again felt, as if by instinct, that the old man was coming towards me. I opened my eyes and saw his waxen face pressed against the window. This time I wanted to get up, but could not. All my limbs seemed to be paralyzed. After taking a good long look at me, the old man disappeared. I heard him wandering around the house and tapping gently on the window of Georges' room. The child turned over on his bed and moaned as he dreamed. After several minutes' silence, the tapping on the window resumed. Then the child groaned once again and woke up. "Is that you, Grandpa?" he asked. "It is me," replied a dead voice, "and I have brought you your little Yagatan. But I dare not go outside. Papa has forbidden it." "There is no need to go outside. Just open the window and embrace me." The child got up, and I could hear him opening the window. Then, somehow finding the strength, I leaped to the foot of my bed and ran over to the partition. I struck it hard with my fist. In a few seconds, Georges was on his feet. I heard him mutter an oath. His wife screamed. In no time at all, the whole household had gathered around the lifeless child. Just as on the previous occasion, there was no sign of Gorcha. We tried carefully to revive the child, but he was very weak and breathed with difficulty. The poor little chap had no idea why he had passed out. His mother and Zdenka thought it was because of the shock of being caught talking with his grandpapa. I said nothing. However, by now the child seemed to be more calm, and everybody except Georges went back to bed. At daybreak, I overheard Georges waking his wife and whispering with her. Shchudenka joined them, and I could hear both the women sobbing. The child was dead. Of the family's despair, the less said the better. Strangely enough, no one blamed the child's death on old Gorcha, at least not openly. Georges sat in silence, but his expression, always gloomy, now became terrible to behold. 2 days passed, and there was still no sign of the old man. On the night of the 3rd day, the day of the child's burial, I thought I heard footsteps all around the house, and an old man's voice which called out the name of the dead child's brother. For a split second, I also thought I saw Gorcha's face pressed against my window, but I couldn't be sure if I was imagining it or not, for the moon was veiled by cloud that night. Nevertheless, I considered it my duty to mention this apparition to Georges. He questioned the child, who replied that he had in fact heard Grandpapa calling, and had also seen him looking in through the window. Georges strictly charged his son to wake him up if the old man should appear again. All these happenings did not prevent my passion for Shchudenka from developing more and more each day. In the daytime, I couldn't talk to her alone. At night, the mere thought that I would shortly have to leave broke my heart. Shchudenka's room was only separated from mine by a kind of corridor which led to the road on one side and a courtyard on the other. When the whole family had gone to bed, I decided to go for a short walk in the fields to ease my mind. As I walked along the corridor, I saw that Shchudenka's door was slightly open. Instinctively, I stopped and listened. The rustling of her dress, a sound I knew well, made my heart pound against my chest. Then I heard her singing softly. She was singing about a Serbian king who was saying farewell to his lady before going to the war. "Oh, my young poplar," said the old king, "I am going to the war, and you will forget me. The trees which grow beneath the mountain are slender and pliant, but they are nothing beside your young body. The berries of the rowan tree which sway in the wind are red, but your lips are more red than the berries of the rowan tree. And I am like an old oak stripped of leaves, and my beard is whiter than the foam of the Danube. And you will forget me, O my soul, and I will die of grief, for the enemy will not dare to kill the old king." The beautiful lady replied, "I swear to be faithful to you and never to forget you. If I should break my oath, come to me after your death and drink all my heart's blood." And the old king said, "So be it." And he set off for the war. Soon the beautiful lady forgot him. At this point, Shchudenka paused, as if she were frightened to finish the ballad. I could restrain myself no longer. That voice, so sweet, so expressive, was the voice of the Duchesse de Gramont. Without pausing to think, I pushed open the door and went in. Shchudenka had just taken off her knitted jacket, of a kind often worn by women in those regions. All she was wearing was a nightgown of red silk, embroidered with gold, held tight against her body by a simple, brightly coloured belt. Her fine blonde hair hung loose over her shoulders. She looked more beautiful than ever. She did not seem upset by my sudden entry, but she was confused and blushed slightly. "Oh," she said, "why have you come? What will the family think of me if we are discovered? Shchudenka, my soul, do not be frightened. Everyone is asleep. Only the cricket in the grass and the mayfly in the air can hear what I have to say to you. Oh, my friend, leave me, leave me. If my brother should discover us, I am lost. Shchudenka, I will not leave you until you have promised to love me forever, as the beautiful lady promised the king in your ballad. Soon I'll have to leave. Who knows when we will see each other again? Shchudenka, I love you more than my soul, more than my salvation. My life's blood is yours. May I not be granted 1 hour with you in return?" "Many things can happen in an hour," said Shchudenka calmly, but she did let her hand slip into mine. "You do not know my brother," she continued, beginning to tremble. "I fear he will discover us." Calm yourself, my darling Shdenka. Your brother is exhausted from watching late into the night. He has been lulled to sleep by the wind rustling in the trees. Heavy is his sleep, long is the night, and I only ask to be granted 1 hour. Then farewell, perhaps forever. Oh, no, no, not forever, cried Shtenka. Then she recoiled, as if frightened by the sound of her own voice. Oh, Shdenka, I see only you, I hear only you. I am no longer master of my own destiny. A superior strength commands my obedience. Forgive me, Shdenka. Like a madman, I clutched her closer to my heart. You are no friend to me, she cried, tearing herself from my embrace and rushing to another part of the room. I do not know what I said to her then, for I was alarmed as she was by my own forwardness, not because such boldness had failed me in the past, far from it, but because, in spite of my passion, I could not help having a sincere respect for Shtenka's innocence. It is true that I had used the language of galanterie with this girl at first, a language which did not seem to displease the society ladies of the time, but I was now ashamed of these empty phrases, and renounced them when I saw that the young girl was too naive to comprehend fully what I meant by them, what you, mesdames, to judge by your suggestive smiles, have understood immediately. I stood before her, at a loss as to what to say, when suddenly she began to tremble and look towards the window, terror-struck. I followed her gaze and clearly saw the corpse-like face of Gorcha staring at us from outside. At precisely that moment, I felt a heavy hand on my shoulder. I froze. It was Georges. "What are you doing here?" he snapped. Embarrassed by his tone of voice, I simply pointed towards his father, who was still staring at us through the window, but he disappeared the moment Georges turned to look at him. "I heard the old man and came to warn your sister," I stammered. Georges looked me straight in the eye, as if trying to read my innermost thoughts. Then he took me by the arm, led me to my room, and left, without a single word. The next day the family had gathered in front of the house around a table laden with jugs of milk and cakes. "Where is the child?" said Georges. "In the courtyard," replied his wife. "He's playing his favourite game, imagining that he is fighting the Turks single-handed." No sooner had she said these words than, to our amazement, we saw the tall figure of Gorcha walking slowly towards us from out of the dark forest. He sat at the table, just as he had done the day I arrived. "Father, we welcome you," murmured Georges's wife in a hoarse voice. We welcome you, father," whispered Shdenka and Pierre in unison. "My father," said Georges, firmly turning pale. "We are waiting for you to say grace." The old man glared at him and turned away. "Yes, grace. Say it now," repeated Georges, crossing himself. "Say it this instant, or by St. George—" Shdenka and her sister-in-law threw themselves at the old man's feet and begged him to say grace. "No, no, no," said the old man. "He has no right to speak to me in that way, and if he continues, I will curse him." Georges got up and rushed into the house. He returned almost immediately, looking furious. "Where is that steak?" he yelled. "Where have you hidden it?" Shdenka and Pierre looked at each other. "Corpse!" Georges shouted at the old man. "What have you done with my elder boy? Why have you killed my little child? Give me back my son, you creature of the grave!" As he said this, he became more and more pale, and his eyes began to burn with fury. The old man simply glared at him. "The steak! The steak!" yelled Georges. "Whoever has hidden it must answer for all the evils which will befall us." At this moment we heard the excited laughter of the younger child. We saw him galloping towards us on a wooden horse, or rather on a long aspen stake, shrieking the Serbian battle cry at the top of his voice. Georges's eyes lit up as he realized what was happening. He grabbed the stake from the child and threw himself at his father. The old man let out a fearful groan and began to sprint towards the dark forest as if possessed by demons. Georges raced after him across the fields, and soon they were both out of sight. It was after sunset when Georges returned to the house. He was as pale as death. His hair stood on end. He sat down by the fireside, and I could hear his teeth chattering. No one could pluck up the courage to question him. By about the time the family normally went to bed, he seemed to be more his usual self, and taking me to one side, said to me quite calmly, "My dear guest, I have been to the river. The ice is gone, the road is clear. Nothing now prevents you from leaving. There is no need," he added, glancing at Zdenka, "to take your leave of my family. Through me, my family wishes you all the happiness you could desire, and hope that you will have some happy memories of the time you have spent with us. Tomorrow at daybreak, you will find your horse saddled and your guide ready to escort you. Farewell. Think about your host from time to time, and forgive him if your stay here has not been as carefree as he would have liked." As he said this, even Georges' rough features looked almost friendly. He led me to my room and shook my hand for one last time. Then he began to tremble, and his teeth chattered, as if he were suffering from the cold. Now I was alone. I had no thoughts of going to sleep, as you can imagine. Other things were on my mind. I had loved many times in my life, and I had experienced the whole range of passions, tenderness, jealousy, fury, but never, not even when I left the Duchesse de Gramont, had I felt anything like the sadness that I felt in my heart at that moment. Before sunrise, I changed into my travelling clothes, hoping to have a few words with Zdenka before I departed. But Georges was waiting for me in the hall. There was no chance of me seeing her again. I leaped into the saddle and spurred on my horse. I had made a resolution to return from Jassy via this village, and although that might be some time hence, the thought made me feel easier in my mind. It was some consolation for me to imagine in advance all the details of my return, but this pleasant reverie was soon shattered. My horse shied away from something and nearly had me out of the saddle. The animal stopped dead, dug in its forelegs, and began to snort wildly as if some danger was nearby. I looked round anxiously and saw something moving about 100 paces away. It was a wolf digging in the ground. Sensing my presence, the wolf ran away. Digging my spurs into the horse's flanks, I managed with difficulty to get him to move forward. It was then that I realized that on the spot where the wolf had been standing, there was a freshly dug grave. I seem to remember also that the end of a stake protruded a few inches out of the ground where the wolf had been digging. However, I do not swear to this, for I rode away from that place as fast as I could. At this point, the Marquis paused and took a pinch of snuff. "Is that the end of the story?" the ladies asked. "I'm afraid not," replied Monsieur Dufay. "What remains to be told is a very unhappy memory for me, and I would give much to cast it from my mind. My reasons for going to Jassy," he continued, "kept me there for much longer than I had expected, well over 6 months, in fact. What can I say to justify my conduct during that time? It is a sad fact, but a fact none the less, that there are very few emotions in this life which can stand the test of time. The success of my negotiations, which were very well received in Versailles, politics, in a word, vile politics, a subject which has become so boring to us in recent times, preoccupied my thoughts and dimmed the memory of Zdenka. In addition, from the moment I arrived, the wife of the hospodar, a very beautiful lady who spoke fluent French, did me the honor of receiving my attentions, singling me out from among all the other young foreigners who were staying in Jassy. Like me, she had been brought up to believe in the principles of French galanterie. The mere thought that I should rebuff the advances of so beautiful a lady stirred up my Gallic blood. So I received her advances with courtesy, and since I was there to represent the interests and rights of France, I made a start by representing those of her husband, the hospodar, as well. When I was recalled home, I left by the same road I had ridden to Jassy. I no longer even thought about Zdenka or her family, but one evening, when I was riding in the countryside, I heard a bell ringing the 8 o'clock chime. I seemed to recognize that sound, and my guide told me that it came from a nearby monastery. I asked him the name. It was the monastery of Our Lady of the Oak. I galloped ahead, and in no time at all we had reached the monastery gate. The old hermit welcomed us and led us to his hostel. The number of pilgrims staying there put me off the idea of spending the night at the hostel, and I asked if there was any accommodation available in the village. "You can stay where you like in the village," replied the old hermit with a gloomy sigh. "Thanks to that devil Gorcha, there are plenty of empty houses." "What on earth do you mean?" I asked. "Is old Gorcha still alive?" "Oh, no, he's well and truly buried with a stake through his heart. But he rose from the grave to suck the blood of George's little son. The child returned one night and knocked on the door, crying that he was cold and wanted to come home. His foolish mother, although she herself had been present at his burial, did not have the strength of mind to send him back to the cemetery, so she opened the door. He threw himself at her throat and sucked away her life's blood. After she had been buried, she in turn rose from the grave to suck the blood of her second son, then the blood of her husband, and then the blood of her brother-in-law. They all went the same way. And Zdenka, oh, she went mad with grief, poor child. Do not speak to me of her." The old hermit had not really answered my question, but I did not have the heart to repeat it. He crossed himself. "Vampirism is contagious," he said after a pause. "Many families in the village have been afflicted by it. Many families have been completely destroyed. And if you take my advice, you will stay in my hostel tonight. For even if the Vourdalaks of the village do not attack you, they will terrify you so much that your hair will have turned white before I ring the bells for the morning mass." "I am only a poor and simple monk," he continued, "but the generosity of passing travellers gives me enough to provide for their needs. I can offer you fresh country cheese and sweet plums which will make your mouth water. I also have some flagons of Tokay wine, which are every bit as good as those which grace the cellars of His Holiness the Patriarch." The old hermit seemed to be behaving more like an innkeeper than a poor and simple monk. I reckoned he had told me some old wives' tales about the village in order to make me feel grateful enough for his hospitality, and to show my appreciation in the usual way by giving the holy man enough to provide for the needs of passing travellers. In any case, the word terror has always had the effect on me that a battle cry has on a war horse. I would have been thoroughly ashamed of myself if I had not set out immediately to see for myself. But my guide, who was less enthusiastic about the idea, asked for my permission to stay in the hostel. This I willingly granted. It took me about half an hour to reach the village. Deserted. No lights shone through the windows. No songs were being sung. I rode past many houses that I knew, all as silent as the grave. Finally, I reached George's. Whether I was being sentimental or just rash, I don't know. But it was there I decided to spend the night. I got off my horse and banged on the gate. Still no sign of life. I pushed the gate, and the hinges creaked eerily as it slowly opened. Then I crept into the courtyard. In one of the outhouses I found enough oats to last the night, so I left my horse tethered there, still saddled, and strode towards the main house. Although all the rooms were deserted, no doors were locked. Zdenka's room had been occupied only a few hours before. Some of her clothes were draped carelessly over the bed. A few pieces of jewellery that I had given her, including a small enamel cross from Budapest, lay on her table, sparkling in the moonlight. Even though my love for her was a thing of the past, I must admit that my heart was heavy. Nevertheless, I wrapped myself up in my cloak and stretched out on her bed. Soon I was asleep. I cannot recall everything, but I do remember that I dreamed of Zdenka, as beautiful, as simple, and as loving as she had been when I first met her. I remember also feeling ashamed of my selfishness and my inconstancy. How could I have abandoned that poor child who loved me? How could I have forgotten her? Then her image became confused with that of the Duchesse de Gramont, and I saw only one person. I threw myself at Shchudenka's feet and begged her forgiveness. From the depths of my being, from the depths of my soul, came an indescribable feeling of melancholy and of joy. I lay there dreaming until I was almost awakened by a gentle musical sound, like the rustling of a cornfield in a light breeze. I heard the sweet rustling of the corn and the music of singing birds, the rushing of a waterfall and the whispering of trees. Then I realized that all these sounds were merely the swishing of a woman's dress, and I opened my eyes. There was Shchudenka, standing beside my bed. The moon was shining so brightly that I could distinguish every single feature which had been so dear to me, and which my dream made me love again as if for the first time. Shchudenka seemed more beautiful and somehow more mature. She was dressed as she had been when I last saw her alone, a simple nightgown of red silk, gold embroidered, and a coloured belt clinging tightly above her hips. "Shchudenka," I cried, sitting up. "Is it really you, Shchudenka?" "Yes, it is me," she replied in a sweet, sad voice. "It is the same Shchudenka you have forgotten. Why did you not return sooner? Everything is finished now. You must leave. A moment longer and you are lost. Farewell, my friend. Farewell forever. Shchudenka, you have seen so much unhappiness, they say. Come, let us talk. Let us ease your pain. Oh, my friend, you must not believe everything they say about us. But leave me now. For if you stay any longer, you are doomed." "Shchudenka, what are you afraid of? Can't you just grant me an hour, just 1 hour, to talk with you?" Shchudenka began to tremble, and her whole being seemed to undergo a strange transformation. "Yes," she said, "1 hour. Just 1 hour. The same hour you begged of me when you came into this room and heard me singing the ballad of the old king. Is that what you meant? So be it. I will grant you 1 hour. But no, no," she cried, as if fighting her inclinations. "Leave me. Go away. Leave me. Now. I tell you, fly. Fly while you still have the chance." Her features were possessed with a savage strength. I could not understand why she should be saying these things, but she was so beautiful that I determined to stay, whatever she said. At last she surrendered, sat down beside me, and spoke to me of the past. She blushed as she admitted that she had fallen in love with me the moment she had set eyes on me. But little by little, I began to notice that Shchudenka was not as I had remembered her. Her former timidity had given way to a strange wantonness of manner. She seemed more forward, more knowing. It dawned on me that her behavior was no longer that of the naive young girl I recalled in my dream. Is it possible, I mused, that Shchudenka was never the pure and innocent maiden that I imagined her to be? Did she simply put on an act to please her brother? Was I gulled by an affected virtue? If so, why insist that I leave? Was this perhaps a refinement of coquetry? And I thought I knew her. What did it matter? If Shchudenka was not a Diana, as I thought, she began to resemble another goddess, at least as attractive, perhaps more so. By God, I preferred the role of Adonis to that of Actaeon. If this classical style that I adopted seems a little out of place, madame, remember that I have the honour to be telling you of incidents which occurred in the year of grace 1758. At that time, mythology was very fashionable, and I am trying to keep my story in period. Things have changed a lot since then, and it was not so long ago that the Revolution, having overthrown both the traces of paganism and the Christian religion, erected the goddess Reason in their place. This goddess, mesdames, has never been my patron saint, least of all when I am in the presence of other goddesses, and at the time I am referring to, I was less disposed than ever to worship at her shrine. I abandoned myself passionately to Shdenka, and willingly outdid even her in the provocative game she was playing. Some time passed in sweet intimacy, until, as Shdenka was amusing me by trying on various pieces of jewellery, I thought it would be a good idea to place the little enamel cross around her neck. But as I tried to do this, Shdenka recoiled sharply. "Enough of these childish games, my dearest," she said. "Let us talk about you and what is on your mind." This sudden change in Shdenka's behaviour made me pause a moment and think. Looking at her more closely, I noticed that she no longer wore around her neck the cluster of tiny icons, holy relics and charms filled with incense, which Serbians are usually given as children to wear for the rest of their lives. "Shdenka," I asked, "where are those things you used to wear around your neck?" "I have lost them," she replied impatiently, and hastily changed the subject. I do not know exactly why, but at that moment I began to feel a strong sense of foreboding. I wanted to leave, but Shdenka held me back. "What is this?" she said. "You asked to be granted an hour, and here you are trying to leave after only a few minutes. Shdenka, you were right when you tried to persuade me to leave. I think I hear a noise, and I fear we will be discovered." "Calm yourself, my love. Everyone is asleep. Only the cricket in the grass and the mayfly in the air can hear what I have to say. No, no, Shdenka, I must leave now." "Stay, stay," she implored. "I love you more than my soul, more than my salvation. You once told me that your life's blood belonged to me. But your brother, Shdenka, I have a feeling he will discover us." "Calm yourself, my soul. My brother has been lulled to sleep by the wind rustling in the trees. Heavy is his sleep, long is the night, and I only ask to be granted 1 hour." As she said this, Shdenka looked so ravishing that my vague sense of foreboding turned into a strong desire to remain near her. A strange, almost sensual feeling, part fear, part excitement, filled my whole being. As I began to weaken, Shdenka became more tender, and I resolved to surrender, hoping to keep up my guard. However, as I told you at the beginning, I have always overestimated my own strength of mind. And when Shdenka, who had noticed that I was holding back, suggested that we chase away the chill of the night by drinking a few glasses of the good hermit's full-blooded wine, I agreed with a readiness which made her smile. The wine had its desired effect. By the second glass, I had forgotten all about the incident of the cross and the holy relics. Shdenka, with her beautiful blonde hair falling loose over her shoulders, with her jewels sparkling in the moonlight, was quite irresistible. Abandoning all restraint, I held her tight in my arms. Then, mesdames, a strange thing happened. One of those mysterious revelations that I can never hope to explain. If you had asked me then, I would have denied that such things could happen, but now I know better. As I held Shdenka tightly against my body, one of the points of the cross, which the Duchesse de Gramont gave me before I left, stuck sharply into my chest. The stab of pain that I felt affected me like a ray of light passing right through my body. Looking up at Shdenka, I saw for the first time that her features, though still beautiful, were those of a corpse, that her eyes did not see, and that her smile was the distorted grimace of a decaying skull. At the same time, I sensed in that room the putrid smell of the charnel house. The fearful truth was revealed to me in all its ugliness, and I remembered too late what the old hermit had said to me. I realized what a fearsome predicament I was in. Everything depended on my courage and my self-control. I turned away from Shdenka to hide the horror which was written on my face. It is then that I looked out of the window. and saw the satanic figure of Gorcha leaning on a bloody stake and staring at me with the eyes of a hyena. Pressed against the other window were the waxen features of Georges, who at that moment looked as terrifying as his father. Both were watching my every movement, and I knew that they would pounce on me the moment I tried to escape, so I pretended not to know they were there, and with incredible self-control continued, yes, mesdames, I actually continued passionately to embrace Stenka, just as I had done before my horrifying discovery. Meanwhile, I desperately racked my brains for some means of escape. I noticed that Gorcha and Georges were exchanging knowing glances with Stenka, and that they were losing patience. Then, from somewhere outside, I heard a woman shriek and the sound of children crying, like the howling of wild cats. These noises set my nerves on edge. Time to make for home, I said to myself, and the sooner the better. Turning to Stenka, I raised my voice so that her hideous family would be sure to hear me. "I'm tired, my dear child. I must go to bed and sleep for a few hours. But first I must go and see whether my horse needs feeding. I beg you to stay where you are and to wait for me to come back." I then pressed my mouth against her cold, dead lips and left the room. I found my horse in a panic, covered with lather and crashing his hooves against the outhouse walls. He had not touched the oats, and the fearful noise he made when he saw me coming gave me gooseflesh, for I feared he would give the game away. But the vampires, who had almost certainly overheard my conversation with Stenka, did not appear to think that anything suspicious was happening. After making sure that the main gate was open, I vaulted into the saddle and dug my spurs into the horse's flanks. As I rode out of the gates, I just had time to glimpse a whole crowd gathered around the house, many of them with their faces pressed against the windows. I think it was my sudden departure which first confused them, but I cannot be sure. The only sound I could hear at the moment was the regular beat of my horse's hooves, which echoed in the night. I was just about to congratulate myself on my cunning when all of a sudden I heard a fearful noise behind me, like the sound of a hurricane roaring through the mountains. 1,000 discordant voices shrieked, moaned, and contended with one another. Then complete silence, as if by common assent, and I heard a rhythmic stamping like a troop of foot soldiers advancing in double-quick time. I spurred on my horse until I tore into his flanks. A burning fever coursed through my veins. I was making one last effort to preserve my sanity when I heard a voice behind me which cried out, "Stop! Don't leave me, my dearest. I love you more than my soul. I love you more than my salvation. Turn back! Turn back! Your life's blood is mine." A cold breath brushed my ear, and I sensed that Stenka had leaped onto my horse from behind. "My heart, my soul," she cried, "I see only you. I hear only you. I am not mistress of my own destiny. A superior force commands my obedience. Forgive me, my dearest. Forgive me." Twisting her arms around me, she tried to sink her teeth into my neck and to wrench me from my horse. There was a terrible struggle. For some time I had difficulty even defending myself, but eventually I managed to grab hold of Stenka by curling one arm around her waist and knotting the other hand in her hair. Standing bolt upright in my stirrups, I threw her to the ground. Then my strength gave out completely, and I became delirious. Frenzied shapes pursued me, mad, grimacing faces. Georges and his brother Pierre ran beside the road and tried to block my way. They did not succeed, but just as I was about to give thanks, I looked over my shoulder and caught sight of old Gorcha, who was using his stake to propel himself forward, as the Tyrolean mountain men do when they leap over alpine chasms. But Gorcha did not manage to catch up with me. Then his daughter-in-law, dragging her children behind her, threw one of them to him. He caught the child on the sharpened point of his stake. Using the stake as a catapult, he slung the creature towards me with all his might. I fended off the blow, but with the true terrier instinct, the little brat sunk his teeth into my horse's neck, and I had some difficulty tearing him away. The other child was propelled towards me in the same way, but landed beyond the horse and was crushed to pulp. I do not know what happened after that, but when I regained consciousness, it was daylight, and I found myself lying near the road next to my dying horse. So ended, mesdames, a love affair which should perhaps have cured me forever of the desire to become involved in any others. Some contemporaries of your grandmother's could tell you whether I had learned my lesson or not, but, joking aside, I still shudder at the thought that if I had given in to my enemies, I would myself have become a vampire. As it was, heaven did not allow things to come to that, and so far from wishing to suck your blood, mesdames, I only ask, old as I am, to be granted the privilege of shedding my own blood in your service.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
So that was The Family of the Vourdalak by Aleksei Nikolaevich Tolstoy. Tolstoy, I believe you might say that in Russian. I learned a bit of Russian once. It was sponsored by Ed Winter very kindly. So he has given me money to pay for my expenses in producing this. So and it's his gift to you. Okay, so thanks, Ed. Now, let's get the elephants in the room out of the way first. First of all, I was reading the story and I thought, first of all, the dog gets shot. I think, oh no. As I'm reading it, I think there's a few letters coming in, a few emails. And then and the horse gets killed. Oh no. And in between times, if you're not an animal lover, there's this guy who is an old roué this French guy, he's with these Austrian women old enough to be his granddaughters, flirting with them and telling how he pushed into some poor young Serb lass's bedroom and then pulled her to him. And then, so that was tremendous. I thought, oh no. And then, of course, the sexist attitude of the brother. He's got a Georges, because this is written in French, but there's a note about Georgi, it would have been in Russian, and then I did note what it would have been in Serbian, but it was written in French, so Georges and Pierre, which may have struck you as odd, and they are treating their sister like she is a possession, and so I thought there's more letters. The first thing to say is, take all this up with Aleksei Nikolaevich Tolstoy. He died in 1945. You may need a seance, but we're coming up to Halloween, so it's a good time of year. And you can point out to him that you were very upset about these various things. But remember also, in a also light-hearted way, that this is a story this is a channel. We do horror stories. And you should expect to be a little bit horrified. And that's why you're here. And also, if a story works, it generates strong emotion. I say this. If you felt strong emotion of any kind, fear, a little bit titillated, I don't know if anybody would have been by that, upset, whatever, outraged. Remember, outrage is the emotion of the internet. These days, the internet is an outrage generation machine. But if you felt any emotions like this, then he's done his work. Anyway, let's get to some proper stuff. So Alexei Nikolaevich Tolstoy was born in 1883. He is not the same War and Peace Tolstoy, okay? He's not him. And he's not Leo Tolstoy. So Well, let's tell you about this guy. Alexei Nikolaevich was born in 1883 in Nikolaevsk in Russia. He was a prominent Soviet writer. Well, in fact, he was an aristocrat, and he left Russia. And then he decided, and he had a very successful life in the West, and then he decided he was going home to Russia. And rather than being thrown in the gulag by Stalin, Stalin took to him, and he became known as the Comrade Count. He hated the Bolsheviks, but then he embraced the Bolshevik cause when, we might say, when it served his purposes. So he wrote a lot of science fiction as well. He's distantly related to the more famous Leo Tolstoy, but he carves out his own literary path. He was from an aristocratic family. We said that. His early works were influenced by Russian symbolism, but he later shifted towards realism and historical fiction. This is not realistic, but it's historical, one might argue. Well, it is. Throughout his career, Tolstoy demonstrated remarkable versatility. His trilogy, The Road to Calvary, chronicled the tumultuous period of Russian history from 1914 to 1919, encompassing World War I and the Russian Revolution. He also wrote a book about Peter I, a historical novel about Peter the Great, and he earned several Stalin prizes. Again, some of you are now outraged. Just let it be. Let's just let it be. So he became a respected author known as a Comrade Count. A complex legacy, they say. Let's talk about the family of the Vourdalak. Let's give you some historical context first. So there was a vampire hysteria that swept through parts of Central Europe in the 18th century, particularly regions such as Serbia, Romania, Croatia. So this is a Russian writing in French. The Russian aristocrats often spoke French. And although he's an Eastern European, this is Peter the Great's country, and he's living in, Moscow and St. Petersburg. So these backwaters, as were considered the Balkans, Eastern Europe, served the same purpose as Le Fanu's Carinthia and Bram Stoker's Transylvania. We have the modern European urban world, and then we have these mysterious, romantic, Gothic, in fact, Eastern places. So let's talk about the vampire hysteria, which was a real thing, and there were commissions of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and also, as he says in the story, some of the Russian emperor, I think, or the Germans looked into it. So the hysteria, the vampire hysteria, reached its peak between 1725 and 1735, with several well-documented cases of alleged vampire activity. One of the most notorious incidents occurred in 1725 in the Serbian village of Kisilova, now Kisiljevo. A peasant named Peter, I'm going to murder these Serbian names, Peter Piotr Plogojovic, maybe, and he died, and within several weeks, several other villagers reported nightmares featuring the deceased man. When a series of unexplained deaths followed, the villagers became convinced that Plogojovic had become a vampire. 2 years later, there was another significant case in the Serbian town of Medveja. Excuse me, Serbs. Arnold Paule. And Paule was a former soldier who was believed to have been attacked by a vampire during his military service in Greece. Greece is also this Balkan wildland, I think particularly because it had been under Turkish rule. All these places had been ruled by the Ottoman Turks until relatively recently. And that made them more exotic and Gothic and unchristian, Although they remained Christian, of course, the Serbs and the Greeks and all the other Balkan people, apart from the Albanians. After his death, so there were official investigations by the Austrian authorities, because it was all the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and their reports would look at the vampire corpses, describe bodies in an unusually preserved state with apparent signs of fresh blood. And of course, this just fueled the hysteria. So the panic, and it had these newly acquired territories after the Ottoman Wars. It had reclaimed these parts of Europe for Christendom, if you like. So, and of course, this goes on but we've got to be aware that this was a real deal. There was later in the 19th century a vampire panic in New England, of all places. But, so when these stories are made, there is a historical context. Okay. So this story family of the Vourdalak was written in 1839 when he was in his early 20s, written in French under the title La famille du Vourdalak, fragment inédit des mémoires d'un inconnu. Oh, I've butchered that as well. So an unedited fragment of the memoirs of an unknown person, of an anonymous person. This Gothic novella showcases his literary prowess at a young age. He wrote it when he was a diplomat for the Russian Empire in Frankfurt. He was doing that and he was on a trip to France. So it was pretty cosmopolitan. It was written in French, but it first appeared in print in Russian, translated by Boleslav Markievich. The Russian version titled was Semya Vourdalaka. Was published in the Russian Messenger in January 1884, long after its initial composition. So it didn't see the light of day until it came out in Russian. So it was, from 1839 to 1884. The original French text remained unpublished until 1950, when it appeared in Revue des études slaves, volume 26, more than a century after its creation. So we know it features this on this diplomat, a young French diplomat, the Marquis d'Urfé. Now, it's very interesting. I think John Fowles is the Magus. His hero has got this name, Durf, anglicised version. Whether John Fowles was aware of this story or it's just a coincidence, I don't know. So we have this 19th century Western European fascination with the Balkans and Southeast and Central Europe. And the Russians are, in this sense, part of the sophisticated urban world. There are parts of Russia which would fall within this mysterious eastern part. But I'm guessing that Tolstoy himself, in France and in Germany, saw himself very much part of this Western culture, I don't know. But it's a frame story. So, frame stories, somebody's sitting around and they say, listen, I'll tell you a story. Famous one is The Turn of the Screw, but there's loads of them do them. M.R. James does them, E.F. Benson does them. It's a very common feature in this Victorian period. And the Edwardians, of course, later on. So, and he says it took place in 1759 when he's trying to titillate these young women around the fire. And he's a bit of a louche dude, isn't he, really? So the Vourdalak is a variant of the vampire myth, which was, this when we're talking about, we've just quoted the Serbian vampire stuff from the mid-18th century. Just a few, and this is more than a few years. So we're talking about the 1720s to 1735 with the vampire hysteria, and this is set in 1759, but it was written in 100 years later, basically in 1839. Well, not quite 100. My math isn't that bad. 80 years later. So the Vourdalak is this Balkan, this particularly Serbian variant of the vampire, or you could say the original vampire, given that Western European vampires and American vampires later, Twilight, I'm looking at you, Buffy, I'm looking at you, have their origins in Balkan myth, and the Vourdalak here. And the Greeks have versions of it as well. Like the real Serbian hysteria, that they particularly like the blood of their relatives. So there's a couple of things going on here. There's the vampire stuff. Oh, we should say its influence can be traced. There was a 1963 film called Black Sabbath, not featuring the band, but was based partly on this story. Before we get into kind of talk a little bit more, we'll put it into we're trying to frame its context, both its real life chronological context, what was happening in the real world in terms of vampire hysteria, but also what was happening in European literature, 1839. So we know that The Vampire, John Polidori, done it on the channel if you want to listen to it, came out in 1819. The Gothic novel, the first Gothic novel, Castle of Otranto, 1765. The big explosion in Gothic stories, particularly Gothic romance, with Anne Radcliffe, is the 1790s. She was a mega star. She earned so much it would have put Mick Jagger to shame. She was the Mick Jagger and think of other, Michael Jackson, if you like, maybe not Michael Jackson, of her age. Okay, so that's 1790. So Gothic is doing well. It keeps going down and pulsing up again. So we have 1719, we have The Vampire. We have Wake Not the Dead, Lass die Toten ruhen. Ernst Raupach's done it on the channel in English, 1823. So the vampire stories are keeping coming through. And then we have the proletarian James Malcolm Rymer's Varney the Vampire in the Penny Dreadfuls from 1845 to 1847. And then in French in 1836, we have Théophile Gautier's La Morte Amoureuse, The Dead in Love, or The Dead Lover, really, 1836. And then there's another Alexander Dumas, The Pale Lady, La Dame Pâle, which appeared in 1849. And then we have, as it goes on, we have Carmilla, the Irish novelist Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, 1872. And then we have, of course, Dracula itself, 1897. So it's almost like the vampire novel doesn't sleep. You know, all through this period, there are vampire stories coming out. And the variants of vampires. Now, our idea of vampire is kind of, we know what the vampire does: mirrors, running water, steaks, garlic, only at night, only when invited in. These things have been accreted to the vampire as time goes on. And the early vampires had their own duty things. I mean, it doesn't stop grandpa coming in, does it? So, yeah, the Vourdalak is a variant of Vulkodolak or Vokodlak, originally referring to werewolves in South Slavic mythology. And we see this in early days. The vampire and the werewolf are, they're not separate monsters as we have them now. They are closely related and variants. So, and this idea about putting a stake through the heart is a Balkan thing. Then also you should cut the head off and you should bury them at a crossroads. I don't know where those come from. But yeah, particularly we have, we've mentioned about the Eastern European versus the Western European stuff going on, sophisticated versus unsophisticated. Just saying about the story. So we have a vampire story, don't we? We have a vampire story. And then we have a love story. And then the two come together nicely. So we have, in many horror stories, there is a sin that is in Frankenstein. We have Victor Frankenstein. His sin is hubris, and also he wants to resurrect, in some sense, his dead mother. Through this, he wants to rescue. He wants to beat death, doesn't he? The sin, that is the sin. In other stories, they build a house on Indian burial grounds. That's desecration, isn't it? And disrespecting the past and disrespecting the owners of the land, if you like, or the original owners of the land. And you get that in the Pallinghurst Barrow, where the owners of the land are the Bronze Age people. So there is disrespect, there's hubris. These are all sins, and they can be. We know that the sinner, in Christian tradition, his soul is open to the devil. The devil can take a sinner's soul. So it's kind of that, isn't it? And Durfey is a sinner, isn't he? He's a vulgar. He's promiscuous. He falls in love with the French countess and he leaves her. And then a day later, he's going, "Oh yeah, you're all right, Shtenka," or Zdenka in Russian. I would have preferred Zdenka, to be fair. Shtenka sounds much like stinker. I was aware of when I was saying that. But Zdenka, the Russian, I would have been okay with that. But apparently, it may be that the Serbian is Shtenka. I don't know. A Serb will have to tell me. So, where was I? Yeah, so so in many cases the sinner is punished, and that is the horror. The sinner does not get away with the sin. I read Hell House by Richard Matheson recently, and they're all sinners, and they don't get away with the sin. Most of them are punished in that. It's a good book. It's a bit too racy to read out on the podcast, apart from copyright issues as well. There's bosoms in it, and heaven knows how many letters that would generate. So yeah, so the story, yes, he's a sinner, he deserves to be punished, but he gets away with it. He even kills his horse in his really interesting story. It was well written in the sense of those two story themes coming together. The horrible lascivious old count pimping himself, and then him almost getting his just desserts. And I think if it was a modern story, the horse wouldn't have died, the dog wouldn't have died, but he would. Yeah, how about that?
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so? Isn't that so?